Chapter 17, A Stranger at Pa's Place. From the small dark opening into Kipper and Pa's quarters, there rose a head of hair bright as a basket of oranges, followed by a face with cheeks whipped into a cheerful red by wind and sun, and a pair of sea blue eyes that matched only one other pair in the world. This had to be Kipper's Pa. Directly behind him appeared another man in the uniform of a common seaman. Whatever positions of his face were not covered by a golden beard were deeply bronzed by the sun. His shoulders, broad as a hatch cover, seemed to fill the small room, and he was tall enough that he stooped when he reached the front step, as if from a long experience he expected the top of his head to have encountered the ceiling. Emily could not remember seeing this man in the cellar of the Jolly Sailor, but there were so many around at that ugly table. Perhaps he had been there. Kipper stared cautiously, but when he started to speak, Pa motioned him to be silent by putting a restraining finger to the lips. Then Pa motioned to the stranger toward the unlit corner of the room. Without uttering a word, he went there and stood with his hands folded, staring silently across the room at the captain. "Now, who have we here?" Kipper's Pa's voice was as cheerful as a sunny day on the shore. He beamed at Emily as if there were no hint of drama having to do with life and death being enacted in his home. "This here's Emily, Pa," Kipper said. "And Emily, this here's Pa." "Ain't ever been happier to meet anyone in my life," said Pa. "Of course, I can't deny I would probably have preferred livelier circumstances." "I'm pleased to meet you too," Emily said, and dropped him a curtsy. "Mr. She stopped shyly, for want of a proper name to use. "Well now, since you ain't got one of your own, and since all Kipper's friends do likewise, why, I'd be pleased as the tuna found a hole in the net, as I like to say, to have you call me Pa." "Thank you, Pa," said Emily. Pa smiled broadly, but a moment later the smile had faded into a deep frown as he motioned towards the grim object lying across the room. "Has he spoken any words yet, Kipper?" "Ain't said anything, Pa." But as if we heard them, Captain Spurlock gave a terrible groan. "Water, water." "Fetch him a cup, Kipper," Pa said. When Kipper returned with the water, Pa thrust a folded blanket under Captain's head, and Kipper held the cup to his lips. "Thank ye," the captain whispered hoarsely. Then after several deep, painful breaths, he said, "Be she here, the child, Emily Lockhart?" "Right here, Captain," said Kipper. He motioned to Emily to draw near the bunk so Captain might see her. Emily gathered every ounce of courage she had to cross the room again, this time under the piercing gaze of the stranger standing motionlessly as a tombstone in the dark corner. With great difficulty, the captain turned his head to stare at her long and hard. "Aye, she be the one. And the other fishmonger, he be here too?" "Here too, Captain," replied Pa, but he made no move to invite the stranger to the bunk. Good. And did he bring the papers, son?" "Here, Captain." Kipper thrust his sheaf of papers into Captain Spurlock's outstretched hand. Thank ye. Now give me a moment to speak, or to rest before I speak again." The captain's eyes drifted shut, and for several moments he lay so still it seemed that he had died. But at length his eyes opened once more. With trembling hands he lifted the papers and read wordlessly. "These be the ones, all right. These be the papers from the lawyer firm of Dowling, and Farewell, stating that Emily Lockhart's Pa died a rich man, and Emily's ma being also dead, all the money being stolen by Plumley and Meaching Inc. belongs rightfully to the child Emily here." Captain Spurlock laid his head back with a groan. "Read 'em." Kipper took the papers from his hands and parceled them out to Emily and Pa. After that, the room was silent as they read, except for an occasional wee-oo from Kipper and Pa. Finally, Kipper looked at Emily. His eyes were huge. "Dingus, Emily, you're a Harris." "Ain't no question about that," said Pa. But I don't understand," stammered Emily. Why did Aunt Twice tell me that Pa died a pauper? Is Aunt Twice he speaks of the same as Mrs. William Dorcas Luckock? The captain asked weakly. Emily nodded. Well, child, the reason for that is because she received a letter to the fact. A letter? Forgery, gasped Captain Spurlock. All letters received by her, forgeries. All letters sent by her likewise, after being stolen by the earlier mentioned Plumley and Meeching Inc. Millie looked with questioning eyes at Pa and Kipper and turned back to Captain Spurlock. Why? Why are you telling me all these things now? Because I ain't got long to live, child, and I don't want any more murders on my soul. Murders? Pa blurted out. In what way murders, Captain? So happens, fishmonger. If anything goes amiss with the child, Emily, then all falls to her Aunt Twice, Plumley, and Meeching Inc., courtesy of another forgery, are seeing to it that anything goes amiss with the child's Aunt Twice, all falls to them. Ye can pretty well figure out the rest. Emily and Aunt Twice to be murdered? Certainly there was no question now that Emily must run away, and with Aunt Twice, if possible. But what about the old people? Emily asked. What's to happen with them? The old people are a sad cover for an ugly book, child. But far as I know, naught worse will happen to them than has already happened. It was the above-mentioned murders that caused the fight that did me in. Smuggling and stealing all that loot was one thing, but murder, Emily Luckock and her aunt, I wanted naught to do with it. My first mate, Sneed, he wasn't so particular, so he sided up with Plumley and Meeching, and I got the business end of his knife in my chest. Moaning with pain, the captain paused. Now, for the benefit of someone in this room, what I say next had best be put in writing. So if someone will take up a pen and a piece of paper, writing while I speak, I'd be much obliged. Kipper ran to the chest at once for pen and ink and paper, as Pa said. Kipper, our handwriting ain't such as most folks can read it. Perhaps Emily must take the pen in hand for Captain. So it was Emily who knelt down on the floor beside the dying captain, and by trembling light of the small brass lantern at the bedpost put down the words he spoke. I, Captain Zacchaeus Zachariah Spurlock, being a sound mind and sound, if not sound body, do hereby confess that Seaman William Dorcas Luckock, of the Silver She, never did commit the murder of one Bellamy Q. Biggs on the same ship. 5 years passed after a gambling quarrel, but instead was drugged and placed in his hand one of the bloody knives used to kill the same by Miss Prulina Blossom Plumley. Theodiza Cy Meeching, and I, the above-mentioned Captain Spurlock. Whether mine was one of the 3 knives that had finished Bellamy Q. Briggs, I know not, but I cannot go to my Maker with it upon my conscience. I cannot go likewise without proclaiming the innocence of William Dorcas Luckock, Emily's uncle. These long years have Plumley, Meeching, and Spurlock held the threat of the hangman's noose over his head, keeping his wife in fear and terror for his life, and taking over the great mansion of Sugar Hill Hall, which by rights belongs to him, though he lost all else by gambling in a wild life, long since regretted. The captain took a deep, agonizing breath, gathering strength to continue. Now quickly, child, for my life is fading fast. Give me the pen and paper, and let me put my name to it. With shaking fingers, Emily placed the pen in the gnarled hand and the paper under it. Uncle Twice really alive? Uncle Twice? The one all along who Aunt Twice had been protecting? Uncle Twice, whose very life had hung on her being a prisoner of the dreaded Mrs. Plumley and Mrs. Meeching? And Uncle Twice now freed of all the blame of a crime he never did commit. Uncle Twice, alive and well? Breathed Emily. Aye, child, alive and well, and in this very room. Now go ye and take him this confession signed before witnesses. Uncle Twice in that room? Where? The bronze-bearded, broad-shouldered stranger looked nothing at all like the pale, slendered man pictured in Emily's locket. She looked around the room in confusion. Then the man stepped out of the shadows, and stood in full light with his arms outstretched. And it was Uncle Twice. Tears streaming down her cheeks, Emily ran into the waiting arms and felt them fold around her. At long last, she was home. My darling Emily, forgive me for remaining silent, but I came to this room a murderer, and I thought I might leave a murderer, and never did I want you to know me as that. It was only by this confession that I could make myself known to you. No sooner had Uncle Twice said these words than the captain raised his hand weakly, wanting to be heard. I have no right to ask forgiveness of ye, William Lucock, but I ask it all the same if ye can find it in your heart to forgive me. With Emily's hand in his, Uncle Twice drew close with Captain. Because of what was done to my wife and this innocent child, I find it hard to forgive now. Perhaps in time I will be able to. But for myself, I do forgive, and for saving the lives of these so precious to me, I do also thank you with all my heart. I thank ye, said the captain. 'Tis more than I deserve. By now, his face had become such a ghastly color, and his breathing was so difficult for him. It was clear his life was rapidly ebbing away. Tears again poured down Emily's face, this time for the old man, now losing his life, for having tried to save hers. Shed no tears for me, Emily Lucock, he said, for I am as black-hearted a villain as ever lived. No, never, sobbed Emily, and she bent over, planted a kiss on the terrible scar that stabbed across his forehead. Thank ye, child, he whispered. Then his head rolled over, and he died. Pa removed the blanket from under his head and gently laid it over his grizzled face. For moments there was silence in the room as they all gazed in silence and sadness at the dead captain. Then Pa turned to Uncle Twice. What's to be done now, sir? What do you think is best, sir? Replied Uncle Twice, returning the compliment by addressing Kipper's Pa, sir. For it was easy to see that in his eyes the fishmonger was every bit as a gentleman as he himself had ever been. I think as now we ain't got a choice but to pay a visit to the police for you to present your credentials, followed by a visit to the Jolly Sailor to present Miss Plumley and Miss Meaching with their commitants. You and me can take care of that, whilst Kipper and Emily fly back to Sugar Hill Hall to carry the happy news to Aunt Twice. Pa beamed at the two children before him. How about little Shrimper, Pa? Kipper asked. He ain't needed to watch now. Well, looks how first thing I gotta do is pay a visit to his ma and make a delivery that ain't got anything to do with fish, Kipper. Pa leaned over and scooped little Shrimper up in his strong arms. Despite all drama being enacted in the little boy's presence that night, he had been unable to hold up any longer. With his head dropped on the table, he had once again fallen fast asleep. There is only one chapter left, chapter 18, and you will have it posted tomorrow. Bye, guys.